The night was magic, and on that night, the moonlight seemed to twist, gather like strings of white lace, animate as pulsating orbs of light. She was barefoot, moving through the grass, and something about her called you to see her. She glowed, brought together in the depths of the night by something once thought impossible, something so innately human, yet transcending anything human. She didn't seem to realize the confusion she inspired in her onlookers, walking about aimlessly, keeping her head ducked. What made her most human of all was her subtle cries, carried away by the wind. This is Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. I'm your haunted host, Gabby. As a horror writer, I've fallen in love with exploring and researching haunted locations. Season 1 was all about Pennsylvania, taking me back to the places where I first discovered my connection to the paranormal. Looking forward, I was trying to decide where next. After all, there's thousands of haunted places, all of which I would love to be able to visit. But, to be honest, only one answer felt right. Because 3 years ago, I visited a little town that you may have heard of, called Salem, Massachusetts. And in Salem, I experienced something that truly changed my life. That's a story for another day. But ever since, I've wanted to go back to try to understand what happened that fateful night. And since that night, I've looked at not just Salem, but New England as a place of spirituality, a place that operates on a different frequency, a place where anything can happen, and unexplainable things do happen. So, as November progressed, the leaves fell and the world moved on far too quickly from spooky season. I held on to my favorite time of year in the best way that I knew how, hopping in the car and embarking on a road trip to the most haunted locations in New England. And today's episode is all about my first stop, the Union Cemetery, an old cemetery in Easton, Connecticut. I learned a lot through season 1. What I found most interesting was all of the connections I was able to draw between locations, both in their history and how the paranormal elements came into fruition. I had many moments along my journey that also felt quite kismet, as though it all just fell into place. Traveling to New England, I wanted to view each location together, conducting a case study of sorts. And this is all leading up to the season finale, in which I'll be investigating the infamous Lizzie Borden house. In preparation for staying in the house, I wanted to try to understand the different ways spirit manifests. And going to Salem again is a big part of that. So while season 1 was all about opening myself up to communication, recognizing my ability to communicate with spirit, season 2 is about going deeper. My approach to this trip was different than any others I've taken in the past. I really had no solid plans aside from the Lizzie Borden house and, of course, Salem. Other than that, I was just going where the wind takes me, learning new stories and discovering new places along the way. I didn't approach each stop as a formal investigation. Rather, I was aiming to prepare myself for the Lizzie Borden house, my most in-depth, challenging, and, as I would eventually learn, active investigation to date. Each stop was just a piece of a much larger journey. And where better to start than the Union Cemetery, which is known to be a hotspot of paranormal activity, with the same spirits showing up consistently and making themselves known in a variety of ways. One day in 1993, a firefighter named Glenn Pennell was responding to a transformer explosion in Monroe, Connecticut. He was driving his Ford F-150 along Route 59 near the Union Cemetery. A policeman was in his passenger seat to accompany him to the explosion. Suddenly, a woman appeared before them in the road. The officer yelled, and Glenn slammed on his brakes, but not in time to stop. Glenn would later describe that it felt like he'd hit a brick wall. The back of his truck went into the air. The two men launched forward against the dashboard. The woman's body rolled up over the hood of the truck, before falling lifelessly to the ground. The driver behind Glenn had witnessed the entire accident. She rushed from her car, approaching Glenn's window. In horror, she yelled, "Oh my God, I can't believe you hit that woman." Glenn got out of his truck, in shock over what he had done. But that shock suddenly turned to confusion. There was no blood, no body, no woman. A dent in the hood, though, validated the sheer force that Glenn and the police officer had felt. She'd been there. Surely she'd been there, and they hit her. Now it was as though it had all been imagined. Besides the dent, all Glenn had to hold on to was the quick, yet detailed look he had at the woman. Her face had been concealed, but she had long, dark hair and was dressed in a white, flowing gown. Glenn did all he could. He searched the area with absolutely no evidence of a deceased or injured woman. He called all local hospitals and stations, only to discover there had been no hit-and-run victims or incidents reported. It was highly unlikely, if not totally impossible, that she'd gotten up and walked away, especially going unseen by the 3 witnesses to the accident. However, as Glenn would soon learn, this was not the only sighting of a woman in white. In fact, this very woman was on the radar of 2 local, yet world-famous paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Their 1992 book, Graveyard, investigated the backstory of this woman, as well as the other reported hauntings of the Union Cemetery. Ed Warren claims to have captured the White Lady on camera on September 1st, 1990, at exactly 2:40 a.m. It was his 7th night filming in the cemetery when she allegedly appeared, making herself known not just to Ed, but imprinting herself on his video footage. Footage that, by the way, has remained within the family and has never been shared with the public. Ed believed the White Lady was impacted by the transformer explosion on that day in 1993. The static electricity, he theorized, turned her form solid, allowing her to physically interact from the other side, causing the damage to Glenn's truck. The first documented sighting of the White Lady was in the mid-1900s, when 2 young brothers named Frank and Bo Barberry were playing along the edges of the cemetery. The woman appeared within a glowing white light, standing out in the dark of night. She wept, a tall, dark, shadowy figure rising up behind her. The boys ran home, terrified by what they had seen. And while their parents dismissed it all as the visions of imaginative children, the boys were sure of the woman in white. Frank and Bo Barberry lived nearby, and they spent a lot of time on or near the cemetery grounds growing up, spotting the woman multiple times since. Their stories eventually made their way to the Warrens, who investigated and ultimately named the Union Cemetery as the most haunted cemetery in Connecticut. Lorraine Warren believed it possibly even stands as a sort of spiritual beacon for wandering souls across New England, making it such a paranormally active location. The Union Cemetery has graves dating back to the 1760s, before Easton, Connecticut was even an established town. It's possible there are graves from long before as well, which were not marked or are now marked by stones that are weathered and damaged. As we'll discuss this season, New England was witness to a lot of death, illness, violence, and tragedy in its early history. Perhaps this small cemetery in a small Connecticut town, could hold the emotion behind that history. New England in itself is a hub of folklore and energy, and the Union Cemetery is where that energy thrives. Is this woman in white the spirit of a person who has passed? Or is she a manifestation of human emotion? Complex emotion that was left with no resolve in the fragility of human life. In 1990, she was seen, once again, on the nearby roads by a man named Rod Vexey. This time, she was accompanied by another spirit, a man dressed in 1940s clothing, who appeared in Rod's backseat as he drove by the cemetery. I mean, imagine that. You're like driving and you look in your rearview mirror and there's just a man sitting there. At the same time, there she was, the woman in white, standing in the middle of the road, gesturing for Rod to stop. He cried to his wife that night, claiming to have been overtaken by a sympathetic, sorrowful feeling when seeing the woman. Glenn Pennell felt the same thing, even after coming to the conclusion that he didn't actually hit a woman. This lasting, sad feeling has been reported by nearly everyone who has been in the presence of the White Lady. Upon hearing of Glenn's encounter, Ed Warren arranged a meeting with him and Rod Vexey. They offered nearly identical descriptions of the White Lady's appearance. A woman in a white Victorian-era gown, either a nightgown or a wedding dress, with a bonnet concealing her face. Some, like the Barbary brothers, have even heard her pained wails echoing through the cemetery at night. The Warrens and other local researchers tried to figure out who she was and what could have caused her connection to this place. The prevailing belief is that this woman died in her 20s while giving birth. She's been associated with two graves in the cemetery. The final resting places of Harriet Seeley Bryan, who died in 1836, or Harriet R. Seeley, who died in 1853. It's been confirmed that Harriet R. Seeley died in childbirth, and her son died shortly after as well. Perhaps the White Lady is wandering the cemetery, searching for her lost child. Others believe she is Ellen Smathers, whose husband was murdered by a man who was obsessed with her. Her husband's body was left in a sinkhole near the cemetery. We'll never know this woman's true identity, or what is fueling her energy to consistently appear to visitors and investigators. I thought this was an interesting place to visit in my investigation of communicating with spirit. On a November morning, as the fog lifted from the gravestones, I walked along the iron fence before stepping inside. I took a picture on my film camera, looking down a row of stones towards the woods on the opposite end. For about an hour, I explored the cemetery, kneeling down before various stones and reading the names aloud. When I felt compelled to, I'd take another picture. There's a belief that spirits make themselves known when they choose to, in whatever manner they choose to, and to whom they choose to. And this woman in white has historically chosen to make herself known through the medium of film photography. According to the Warrens, film is a powerful investigative tool. Rather than showing themselves to be captured on film, spirits make the choice to imprint themselves on the film. The only problem is, I'll never know if this woman imprinted herself on my film. I got a call from my camera store a few days after dropping off the film to be developed. This particular roll of film had my pictures from the Union Cemetery, as well as most of the other photos I took on this road trip. So I was quite disappointed to hear that once the film was developed, it was discovered that All of the images were blank. There was just nothing there. Now, there are elements of the film photography process that could have caused this. Maybe the film was expired or damaged in some way. Maybe I initially loaded it improperly. The exposure could have been off, or there could have been an issue with development. I will say, though, that I haven't had this happen at all before. I used the same camera and the same type of film I'd been using, all of which I'd gotten around the same time. I loaded it the same way, used the same exposure settings, and I doubt there was any error on the end of the developers. So, and I'm embracing my mysticism here, maybe someone didn't want me to see what I captured. It's just interesting to me knowing this was my first stop, and this was where I took most of my pictures. And the woman in white typically shows up on film. Again, there could be a totally reasonable explanation. Things like this happen with film photography. But it's worth noting. Okay, now let's talk about red eyes. Another spirit seen frequently in the Union Cemetery. He gets his name because he is seen as a pair of glowing red eyes, often following people around the cemetery or spotted looking over the graves from the woods. Seeing these eyes has typically been reported alongside the sensation of hot breath on your neck. Red eyes is supposedly the result of a horrific death that occurred directly across the street from the cemetery. In 1935, Earl Kellogg was lit on fire, left to burn to death. His spirit now exists as a pair of fiery red eyes, bringing a heavier, often darker energy to the cemetery. There have also been what Ed Warren described as black poodles, or spirits appearing as dark wisps, moving close to the ground and weaving between the graves or around the White Lady. While the Warrens believe the White Lady is the result of an earthbound spirit who was once human, they were unsure why these dark figures seemed to be appearing alongside her. Are they controlling her in some way? Are they further manifestations of her emotion? Are they another force in the cemetery entirely? A darker, possibly inhuman energy? Could all of those things be true at once? I left for New England around 3 a.m., reaching Connecticut just as the sun rose. I remembered hearing about the Union Cemetery at the Warrens' Paracon in September. While stopping for coffee, I put it into my navigation. I was the only one there at the time, aside from a truck that stopped briefly outside the gates. The roads running alongside were quite busy, given it was a Monday morning. I do think the surrounding roads are an important element of the story. Their constant movement and flow could fuel the energy in the cemetery, given its position at an intersection. The White Lady has also been seen on these roads just as much, if not more, than actually in the cemetery, which adds validity to these supposed encounters, given they're not all from people going to the cemetery seeking the paranormal, but rather unsuspecting drivers just passing by. Also, these roads tell us a little bit more about the White Lady herself. She's not confined to the cemetery. So what is keeping her bound to this land? Personally, I believe her frequent appearances show her urgency to be heard. Perhaps she was silenced in life. She has a story to tell, possibly wandering to the nearby roads hoping to find someone who will listen to her. However, she always seems to return to the cemetery, crying amongst the graves once night falls. While exploring Union Cemetery, I had this perpetual feeling that someone was watching me. I was actually worried I wasn't supposed to be there, even though I knew I could be. I just felt like I wasn't welcome or like I was doing something wrong. I love exploring cemeteries, especially beautiful old New England cemeteries in the middle of November. I typically don't even believe them to be haunted, just because they feel so peaceful to me. And I tend to believe that spirits are with their loved ones or in places that were important to their life or possibly their death. Fun fact about me, I actually go to cemeteries when I feel like I need to ground myself a bit. My favorite is the Evergreen Cemetery in Gettysburg. It just feels like time slows down and all sound is muted. This one was different, and I can't put my finger on why. Maybe it's the environment with the busy roads nearby, but it just felt like it was humming. And I certainly didn't feel alone. It wasn't scary, just noticeably different from the vibe I typically get in cemeteries. In terms of this whole case study idea, I think what I learned from the Union Cemetery is how to approach actually being in these places. Throughout season 1, I was recording while I was in a location, which I will still do in the future, but I just wanted to have a different approach for this trip in particular. And rather, I was just really focused on interacting with the space. Like I said, I was reading names from the stones, taking pictures, walking around, really taking my time in doing all of that and being very focused on the environment. It helped me feel more present and aligned. That helped me to just look at communication with spirit differently, where I'm not showing up there like talking about these stories and seeing if that stirs anything up. I'm just going there with an open mind, seeing the location almost as its own entity. Like it's, alive and breathing, and I'm there kind of just to observe and take it all in, which I guess I've always kind of done in places like this. And that's why I've been so drawn to haunted places, is because there is just this different side of me that comes out that is so calm in a way and like in tune. But I was just much more intentional about it this time around. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Join me next Tuesday as I continue my exploration of New England hauntings. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay spooky.